Alright guys, so welcome to the second part of our front-end workshop series, where we'll be going over what a React front-end is and the different libraries that will kind of build up the project that we're going to be building for our workshops. This might go a little fast. Don't worry, there's a lot of different parts to this and it's okay to be overwhelmed. The idea is that we put out these videos kind of going over a brief overview so you guys have a lot of time leading up to the actual ZotHacks hackathon to take a look and explore these different things, and you'll get a brief overview in these videos. So an outline for this video, we're going to go over the project that we'll be building. I'll give you like a live example of what we have deployed, and then we'll go over the specific front-end libraries that we're going to be using to kind of enhance our building of the project. So in the last video, we kind of went over JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. This will be going over React and a couple other things that let us kind of enhance our development experience, so we don't have to do a lot of the nitty-gritty work of connecting the JavaScript to the HTML. We'll go over the template overview of the different project that we have, and then we'll kind of go into a coding segment. That might be a separate video, but you'll kind of follow along and I'll discuss the starter code that we have ready for you guys to kind of explore and see the different libraries interacting for the project. So, again, we're going to go over the different elements. I increase the size of the circle because we're kind of incorporating the usage of the Flask server. So we're not building anything here on what's deployed with Heroku. We're just going to be using a deployed instance, but we'll be focusing on usage of the REST API because the front end ultimately needs to communicate with the back end on what information it needs to display. We'll kind of go over the ways we're going to do that. So here I have two pictures. I'm just going to pop out and show you guys a live example of what we have built. Okay, so here is the front end application that we'll be building for the starter pack. Here we're going to start off with this page. This is all going to be pre-made code that uses the backend that we have for our application, and it's going to be a list of users that are pulled from the database. The React component is going to make a query from the backend to pull that list of users, and then it'll render it as a series of cards, each with their own name and email and ID. And this stock ID is kind of the favorite stock that they're going to be pulling. So we'll have a little bit of connection between two different types of data. So I'll kind of go over this in the next video over what builds this page. And then at ZotHacks, in a live demo, we're going to show you how to build this second page, which is this on-click functionality for the stock that we're viewing. What this does is it takes the stock ID, passes it as a URL parameter, and it'll pull information about that stock, both the name, the icon, and then maybe a couple days of stock information from a finance API that you guys will use. And this will kind of be extensible, so you can add whatever stocks you want, and it'll have a lot of different elements, and we'll also kind of teach you how to do these nice little animations so you can enhance the usability of your product and make it look pretty cool. So diving back into the presentation, here are two screenshots of different stocks and the pages. And we'll go into the project libraries for this project. Specifically, the most important one will be React.js. React.js will kind of be the thing that holds all of these different elements together. React Router is just a routing framework. Node Sass is kind of using Sass instead of CSS, but functionally it's almost the same thing, but I'll explain some benefits to that later. We'll use React Viz for rendering the graph and information. Axios for making those API requests to pull information into our front end. And then an optional, is very easy to not include this or include this. For the more advanced folks, we'll have Framer Motion, which is an animation library that's extremely easy to use. So anybody, hopefully by the end of the hackathon, will be creating some fancy animations while they load information on their page. So specifically React.js, we'll have some descriptions talking about this. React.js is a component-based library. A component-based library essentially means we're abstracting information of certain parts into their own components. So, we'll have, let's say, a card component that has its own specific style and takes information into it. And the reason that these component-based component-based libraries are really, really widely used is because they're super scalable. So because you're compartmentalizing different elements, kind of similar to object-oriented programming, it's very easy to make your code very organized across a big application. React specifically too has very few dependencies compared to like Angular or even Vue to some extent, because it's a simple library that's maintained by Facebook, and it uses a lot of native JavaScript functions like .map or .filter as you're developing these things, and it kind of just handles the structure of the components that you're building. And it's also easy to read. So when you take a look at a new component, you'll be able to really quickly see, okay, here's what information this component shows, here's what behavior it has internally, and here's kind of the things that could change what it's displaying. So I think the hardest thing to understand about React, and especially when you're not sure about web development, but we kind of went over like HTML is an element on the page. It is just like a template and series of information and ordering with basic ordering. But what if we wanted to change the information on there? A component kind of handles that all in one. Think of a component in React as just a simple function. And kind of going into this example, here is like a series of HTML code. So we're going to be creating like a custom button component, or maybe a custom card or a custom stock view. Pretty much anything that you want to compartmentalize. Let's just think of this as a button. What React does is it renders this component into just a function call. These squiggly braces mean that you're putting like just JavaScript code in the HTML in JSX. But essentially this like blocky HTML looking component turns into a function call, and it uses it pretty much just returns this information. So the component that could be used for this is right here. This is a function that returns HTML code. So when it renders as a call to that function, it returns the HTML code and then passes that name as a prop into the information. So kind of the information here are kind of like the arguments for the function that you're using. And this is really like the most complicated part of React. Once you kind of understand this idea of like, okay, let's turn different elements of the application into functions so that way we can split it up. That's kind of a majority of the things that you'll need to know for React. And you kind of just need to think about, all right, what behaviors do we have in the application that will kind of change what these functions are showing? And that kind of leads into, how do you do that? How do you make, let's say it says click me on odd days and don't click me on even days. You'll kind of use the two main hooks, use state and use effect. And these are kind of like as complicated as we'll go for our workshop series. Use state and use effect are called hooks because that's just like pretty much just a fancy way of calling a function that we'll use on our front end application. Use state specifically lets us define data in a way that we can use on our application. And I'll kind of get into this a little bit more with the coding example on why we need to use these specific use state and use effects to handle data in our application during the coding part. But kind of just think of it as like, if you're going to show information on the page or hold information in a component, like let's say a list of users or a simple number, you're going to be using use state. And calling use state after importing it, you give it like a little bit of an initial value, then you get back the actual value that it has, and then you have a set function. You can name these whatever we want, but naming semantics generally follow. You have the object and then set object. So after this code is run, number will now equal 0. And then, later in the application, let's just say like as this function is loading, we can set number to be 1. And eventually number will equal 1. Why does it happen eventually? Why does it not equal 1 right afterwards? That kind of gets into asynchronous tasking for JavaScript. Because you have a front end displaying information on the application, that code is running on the browser, which means that when you change certain actions, the browser needs to handle it asynchronously, because everything will break if everything happens sequential like Python. So, this is kind of something that you don't really need to worry about too much. We'll talk about this more in the coding example, but just, kind of stick to having your information in this use state and then setting the information whenever you want to change it, add a number, increment it, decrement it. You'll be using these setting functions. So, we have this element of we don't know when the number will change, but we want to have behaviors that, maybe once number equals 5, we want to, print a celebratory message or something. That gets into the next hook that we'll be talking about, which is useEffect. useEffect lets us define functions that will be run when something changes. So here we have a useEffect that changes one number, and we want to print out the number in the console anytime the number will change. So here we define console.log, and we have a little bit of an array right here. The array takes in anything that we want to watch, essentially, and when that changes, it'll run this function and print out the number. One unique case of this is it will actually print out the number twice, because when you think about when this value is changing, it's going to change initially for the first time when the components run, and then it'll also change again later after this set number is run. So we'll see in the console 0 and 1 printed out. And once you know how to use these things and how to organize the front end parts of your code using the different render functions, this is kind of all you need to build a complex React application. This idea of we have data, we do certain actions, when data changes, we do other actions, and that will kind of get you through the process of like the page loads, it pulls a list of users, and then the users display as cards on the page. So we're going to go a little more granularly into the different libraries. Don't worry about understanding everything right now. We'll kind of do a brief overview, and I'll get more into it during the coding segment. React Router is the primary tool for handling URLs in React. So when we see the application, like I described earlier in the example, we have localhost 3000, and then when I clicked on a user, it sent me to the stock view. And the stock view had a certain ID. There's a lot more characters than this. But React Router lets us change the components that we're rendering based on the routes. So let's say we wanted to render a list of users at this route. So we just define the exact path right here. And then let's say we wanted to render that stock page, which is a different component, when the URL has the stock and then a selected ID. And this little colon right here pretty much means that this is a variable that could change. This means that it always has to say /stock. So it kind of does two things. It handles our organization of what components are showing on the page based on the URL, and it also allows us to take data from the URL. There's a lot more features going into that, but that's kind of the main things you need to know for this workshop. Sass. This is something that's a little unnecessary for this workshop, but don't worry too much about it because it's essentially just kind of an enhancement of CSS. The specific thing that we'll use a lot is variables and nesting CSS. So if you remember in the previous video, I talked about we have kind of subclasses for like the ZotHacks wrapper and ZotHacks information. This will let us clean up our code a little bit. So you can have a card, and then a div inside the card will have its own margin. And then also we'll have things called hack variables, and this will be like the size of spacing and then the background color. So if you ever want to change the background color, you can have like background color main as a variable, and then you can test it and change it in one spot. So then all across the application, across your CSS views, the same things. And then also when you're creating these more complex CSS designs, the code will be a lot more easily organized. So here's something, again, you also don't need to worry about this too much. We decided to use React Viz for the stock view. This is a chart visualization library, and it very simply takes an array of objects as its input. Here it says like data. Don't worry too much about all these components. This is kind of just how the library works, but you can kind of think about it as, okay, we want to set a flexible XY plot. We want to add some grid lines, an XY axis, and a line series for the line that we're drawing based on the stocks. And we have a function that we're calling, and the function will return a list of objects that have X and Y coordinates. It's a lot to take in, don't worry too much, but this is kind of how we'll just place a line graph and display it with data that we have from the database. And the coding example will again get into the specifics of how that page is constructed. And it also, if you want to use it for anything else, it has really nice documentation and it's simple to use. We'll make sure that all of our mentors kind of have experience looking through the documentation so they can help you guys print out the graphs that you want if you want to have like a data analytics app or something. So Axios. Axios another thing that's kind of unnecessary, but it helps us get really clean syntax for making API requests. The backend workshop videos will kind of go over what a REST API is and how that functions, but it'll kind of clean up our code quite a bit. So we can just do syntax like axios.get rather than having like fetch.get, and it cleans up the syntax quite a bit. And also it has really simple documentation, and that's easy to read in a nice README. So one thing that's, I keep saying everything is optional, but that's because everything kind of is. You can build the application however you want. But frame or motion lets us do really easy animations. It abstracts the CSS from animating, which you generally use for animating different things. It has excellent and amazing documentation, and to use it, you'll kind of just add motion.div in front of any type of HTML element. And this will let you animate it and apply certain transitions. So this one adds in a fade transition that goes from opacity 0 to 1 when it's loaded, and it has a 1 second long duration. I'll kind of show this in the coding example as well, but once you kind of get the hang of building your project, I highly recommend checking out an animation library to clean everything up. And that's how we got those nice transitions of the cards sliding into place and fading in the information. So the ZotHacks workshop repo, don't worry about all these branches right here. A branch is essentially a section of information, like it's kind of a state of your project repository. The thing that you're going to want to follow throughout our coding example will be the master branch. When you check out and download the repository from our GitHub repo, it will automatically be set to the master branch. So don't worry about this too much. In a workshop, I'm not sure if we're going to hide this branch until the ZotHacks actual in-person workshop. But this will kind of be the end result of the application that you saw earlier in this video, and that will kind of be the last state. So if you want to check out the final result without writing it yourself, or maybe you want to double check what you wrote, you'll be able to go and check that out. So that kind of finishes it up for the React part of the video series. Hopefully you learned a little bit about React and why we use it, and the different elements that we'll be going into. If you're a little confused, do not worry at all. It's a lot to take in. The thing about web development is there's a lot of different parts, so it'll be a very different experience than learning Python for the first time. So don't be afraid if you're overwhelmed, and if you're not, that's awesome. We'll be able to all utilize the mentorship opportunities to build the applications that you want to do. So for now, you can kind of hop over to the next video where I'm going to go over the base branch that you'll be starting with for the ZotHacks repository. You can kind of get it set up and running on your local environment and view the different code parts, and I'll explain that more in depth there.